back on Monday, which probably seems like an eternity to you by now, the judge talked about the two things that the state has to do in its case. It has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that a crime or crimes were committed in the murders of Robbie and Jennifer Tower and the fleeing to elude. And that the defendant who sits here in the courtroom before you, Dima Tower, is the person who committed those crimes. I think that those things have been proven to you fully during this trial. The only thing that we should talk about today, and that's important for you to focus on, is the defendant's intention. Because in opening statements, defense counsel told you that he was going to argue for a lesser included crime, a crime of manslaughter. So let's think about the instructions that you have in front of you and what they say and why this is not manslaughter and it's not second-degree murder, and it completely and fully meets all the elements of first-degree premeditated murder. Your Honor, I'm having a problem, and I don't know why this isn't working correctly.
All right, let's take a short break. We'll bring IT to try to solve that, okay? Please leave your notepads face down, writing implements on top. Don't discuss anything related to your jury service, okay? All right, everybody may be seated.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. You've probably worn out that carpet by now, going back and forth. But let's continue where I left off. So what we have to focus on are the instructions for law and the evidence in this case. And you have those instructions in front of you, but I have the elements of first-degree murder up on the screen. So to prove the crime of first-degree premeditated murder, the charge that the state has laid against the defendant, actually 2 counts, but I incorporated both Jennifer and Robbie Tower into this instruction. To prove the crime of first-degree murder, the state has to prove the following 3 elements beyond a reasonable doubt. Jennifer and Robbie Tower are dead. There's no question about that. It's uncontested. Their deaths were caused by the criminal acts of Dima Tower. Again, uncontested. Not only do we have all the physical evidence in this case, the knives, the fact that the defendant was covered in blood, the fact that he fled, but we also have his own words. He told the detectives who interviewed him that he killed his parents. So we know that their deaths were caused by Dima Tower, and obviously they were criminal acts because he stabbed them to death. That's a crime. Finally, there was a premeditated killing of Jennifer Tower and Robbie Tower. And how do we know that? We know that because the defendant told us so himself, over and over and over. Yesterday afternoon, on the stand, he told you that himself. Repeatedly to the detectives, and then again, right here in the courtroom where you're sitting today. So let's talk a little bit about premeditation and the definition. Now, back on Monday, I was asking you a lot of questions about what factors should you think about when we're talking about premeditation, and you probably thought, what is this woman talking about? Because you didn't have the facts. You didn't know what went on in this particular case. And I was asking you questions about what would a person do before committing a premeditated act. If you didn't know what was going on in their mind, but you had to look at their actions and determine what was premeditation. We talked about what would a person do while the crime was being committed that would signal premeditation. And we talked about what would a person do after the crime was committed to signal premeditation. And let's think about what we learned in the last 3 days. What did the defendant do before he committed this crime? He chose his weapon from the knife block in the kitchen, and he took it into the bedroom. He armed himself before the encounter with his parents. All of that leaves plenty of time for reflection, for reflective thought. And we also talked about if there are prior difficulties between the parties, does that lend itself to thinking about premeditation? If someone is already angry, and as the defendant said, boiling with rage, does that lend itself to premeditation? Is that one of the factors you should consider? And I would suggest that it is. And then what did the defendant do at the time he was committing the crime, when he was stabbing his parents by a conservative estimate 140 times? We talked about, do the nature of the wounds that are being inflicted, do they show that the defendant had a conscious intent to kill? Well, we know the kind of wounds that he inflicted on the tracheas of both parents and on the multiple stab wounds, especially to the face, the head, the back of the neck, especially the throat, the carotid arteries, and the jugular veins, the most vulnerable, tender part of any human being. We also talked about, is it important to consider the number of wounds inflicted? And we know that there were, again, over 140 wounds, 79 to Robbie, and, 79 to Jennifer, and more than 68 to Robbie. What else at the time that the crime is being committed signals that this was premeditated? What about the fact that when he lost the first knife, he went back into the kitchen and got himself another knife so that he could, as he said, finish what he started? Because he started it deliberately and consciously. He wanted to finish that job. And so he armed himself with another weapon. What else did he do during the crime that shows premeditation? After he killed his father, he walked outdoors, and yesterday he told us that he had the knife in his hand when he went outside. And he led his mother back into the death scene and sat her on the couch, and in his own words, delivered a manifesto. He said it was a monologue. And all the time she's sitting there, and he is planning to kill her. There is no other way to think about it. What else did we talk about during jury selection? We talked about what might signal premeditation after the crime is committed. We know that the defendant washed the second knife and placed it back in the knife block because it was collected as evidence, and we can actually see the little bit of blood in a close-up photo. It was also sent to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, and Ms. Webster told you that there was presumptive blood on both weapons. After he took the knife and placed it back in the knife block after he gave it a cursory wash, he fled from the police. You saw 30 long minutes. It was probably boring, but I thought it was important to impress upon you just how long it took for the police to apprehend the defendant. How long he consciously fled from the police and showed a consciousness of guilt because he knew what he did was wrong. And we know that finally, when he was apprehended, he gave a full admission to consciously deciding to kill. That's premeditation all day long. So let's look at the instructions. Killing with premeditation is killing after consciously deciding to do so. The decision must be present in the mind at the time of the killing. The law doesn't fix the exact period of time that must pass between forming the premeditated intent to kill and the actual killing. But the period of time has to be long enough to allow reflection, long enough for the mind to come up with the idea, the plan, the decision, whatever you want to call it. Long enough to allow reflection by the defendant, and it has to be formed before the killing actually takes place. The question of premeditation is a question for you. It's a question that you have to answer based upon what you heard these last 3 days in the courtroom and the evidence that you've seen. And only you can decide if this was a premeditated act. It's sufficient proof of premeditation if the circumstances of the killing and the conduct of the accused during the killing convince you beyond a reasonable doubt of the existence of premeditation at the time of the killing. Well, let's talk about why this is not manslaughter and why this is certainly not second-degree murder. Let's start with second-degree murder because that's the first of the lesser included. That comes right after first-degree murder and is then followed by manslaughter. And if you want to follow along with me with the jury instructions, you have them before you. If not, you can just listen to what I have to say. Second-degree murder has to be proven by the state beyond a reasonable doubt, and it has to prove the three following elements. Jennifer and Robbie Tower are dead. Yes, we know that. The death was caused by the criminal act of Dima Tower, their adopted child. There was an unlawful killing of Jennifer and Robbie Tower by an act imminently dangerous to another and demonstrating a depraved mind without regard for human life. Is that what happened? Of course it is. It goes on to say that an act includes a series of related actions arising from and performed pursuant to a single design or purpose. An act is imminently dangerous, it goes on to define, to another and demonstrating a depraved mind if it is an act or series of acts that a person of ordinary judgment would know is reasonably certain to kill or do serious bodily injury to another. 2, the act is done from ill will, hatred, spite, or evil intent. And 3, the act or actions are of such a nature that they indicate an indifference to human life. All of those are true. That's exactly what Dima Tower did. But In order to convict of second-degree murder, it is not necessary for the state to prove the defendant had an intent to cause death. That is what's missing from second-degree murder. Dima Tower had every intent to cause the death of both Robbie and Jennifer Tower. He told you so himself. Why isn't this manslaughter? To prove the crime of manslaughter, the jury instructions tell you, the state has to prove the following two elements beyond a reasonable doubt. First, Jennifer and Robbie Tower are dead. And second, Dima Tower intentionally committed an act or acts that caused the death of Jennifer Tower and Robbie Tower. What's missing? Premeditation. The jury instruction goes on to say that in order to convict of manslaughter by act, it is not necessary for the state to prove that the defendant had an intent to cause death. Only an intent to commit an act that was not merely negligent, justified, excusable, or which caused death. But we know from the defendant's own mouth that he had every intention to cause death. He told us so over and over and over again. So the lesser includeds are statutorily mandated to accompany the jury instructions on first-degree murder. But they do not rise, they don't even come close to describing or meeting the elements of what Dima Tower did to his parents on August 31st, 2023, when he sat in that car and thought about killing them, walked into his house, went into his bedroom, came out, grabbed the knife out of the kitchen, and walked into the bedroom and started stabbing his father. Because this is a clear-cut case of first-degree murder. So he talked to detectives on September 1st of 2023, and Detective St. Jean and Detective Chippendale asked him a number of questions. What did you think about last night? I don't like the situation. I don't like the people I'm with. So I'm just going to kill them. That's what he thought about before he killed his parents. That was his plan. You don't need a diagram. You don't need a journal with your thoughts written down. You don't need a flow chart. You don't need a bullet point list to premeditate the killing of your parents. All it takes is long enough time to reflect, to engage in reflective thought. And that's exactly what he did. I don't like the situation. I don't like the people I'm with, so I'm just going to kill them. Did you guys talk at all? And here, I think Detective Chippendale is referring to what happened when the defendant brought his mom back in from outside when she was trying to alert the neighbor and try to get some help. So the detectives asked, did you guys talk at all? Yeah, the defendant responded. I tried to talk to her. How did that conversation go? It was a monologue. So did you stab her already at that point? After I finished what I had to say. He's giving a monologue, talking to his mother in the house. Plenty of time for reflective thought. Again, during that interview that you watched, and I urge you, ladies and gentlemen, to watch it again. You'll have an opportunity to take the most of the evidence back with you, and you can listen to that videotaped and audio tape recording. It's available for you. So last night, you're sitting in your car and you just came up with this, that you're gonna do something now. Defendant said, no, it came before that. Detective says, after work? No, it was before that. I had those thoughts before yesterday. What, days, months? No, like recently. Reflective thought. Later on in the conversation, the detectives ask, was last night the first time you actually thought about killing your parents? No. And yesterday, the last question that I asked, when you were sitting in your car on August 31st, did you decide to kill your parents before you walked into the house? Yes.
What is the location of the emergency?
Listen, it's not much emergency anymore right now, but we live at 1200 Northport Road in Northport. So I was trying to reach Northport Police, so they keep sending me back to this.
Okay, should I get a police issue going on?
No, I was upstairs in bed and my daughter was sleeping downstairs and someone screamed, and banged on our door and rang the doorbell screaming, I need help. Took me a second to register what was going on, and we were trying to find, our gun upstairs before we opened the door and the person's gone.
Okay, well, we'll connect you to Northport so they can check the area. Let me connect you, please.
Okay, thank you.
911, what is the
And this is what law enforcement found when they got to Jonna Walton's house. A blood trail leading up to her home, and at her door, more blood dripping while she rang the doorbell and screamed for help. And as she was out there, the defendant wanted to finish what he started, so he led her back in the house. And then, after he finished what he started, he came outside, covered, according to Officer Ragakis, with blood. And he just nonchalantly got in his car and drove away, covered with his parents' blood. He led the police on a chase for about a half an hour, even at one point endangering other people in the community by going into the northbound lane. And finally, when Sarasota County disabled his car, the stop sticks, he ran into the woods. And we had Officer Ragakis get on the stand and show you, trace out for you, the flight path of the defendant from way down in the southeastern corner of Northport city environs, all the way to I-75, south on I-75, and then he backtracked and drove all the way up to almost the very end of what this map shows in the upper left-hand corner, where he abandoned his car and fled into the woods. And this is what the crime scene and the detectives found at 1240 Malakote Road. This is the carnage inside the house. Blood everywhere, on the door, in the foyer, on the furniture, on the walls, on Dima Tower's parents. and where this crime started. In the bedroom where Mr. Tower was sound asleep next to his wife when the defendant attacked them while they were sleeping in their bed. And you can see the signs of struggle. Looks like Robbie Tower put up quite a fight as best as he could. You can see that there was a brief altercation over on that north wall and again on the wall leading into the living room. Blood everywhere, but the defendant was determined to finish what he started. Even when he lost the first knife, he was determined to finish what he started. So he goes into the kitchen and grabs another knife, and then washes up afterwards. And this is a work product of Dima Tower. This is what he did to his father and to his mother because he didn't like them as people. You also heard testimony that the defendant was finally seen early the following morning after he had been at large for about 9 hours. He was captured on video at the Shell station around about 7:30 in the morning. He actually was blasé enough to walk into the Shell station and buy a bottle of tea. And finally, he was arrested shortly thereafter, around about 8 o'clock, when the Venice Police Department apprehended him, still at the Shell station. And this is what the defendant did to his mother. And I have not put up all the autopsy photos. I think you've seen enough autopsy photos and bloodshed, but this is what he did to his mother after he led her back in the house. Stabbed her multiple times in the face, the throat, and the back. And his father, mutilated to the point where Dr. Vega was able to count 6 separate and distinct perforations, incisions, whatever you want to call them, into Robbie Tower's trachea, his larynx. And you heard the testimony of Dr. Vega yesterday, who told you that the cause of death for Jennifer Tower was perforations of multiple small and large blood vessels, including her carotid artery and jugular vein. Same with Robbie Tower, perforations of multiple small and large vessels, including the carotid and subclavian arteries, due to multiple stab wounds. And Dr. Vega told you about the function of the carotid arteries and the jugular veins, how those are the major vessels that take the blood to the head and back down to the body. And that's where the defendant attacked his parents, in the most vulnerable, fragile places in the human body. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to ask you to think about the jury instructions and what you heard on Monday about sympathy You saw the defendant sobbing here in the courtroom. We had to actually take a break. I think it was on Wednesday during the defense's opening statement. And then again yesterday when the defendant took the stand. He put on quite a display of emotion.
Overruled. Let's move on from this, okay?
He put on quite a display of emotion. Hold him accountable for what he did. You may not have sympathy enter into your deliberations. Your job is to look at the evidence and see if the evidence comports with the law of first-degree murder. You may not have any sympathy for Robbie or Jennifer Tower or the defendant. And that's hard to ask human beings. And you may even have sympathy for all three of those people. But they cannot influence your decision. That cannot influence your decision. You have to compartmentalize that sympathy if you have any. Because the law says that you must judge the defendant on the evidence and the law. Hold him accountable for what he did, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.